Hey, welcome to Point Blank. I'm Adolfus P.U.
And I'm the Reverend Daryl Gray.
Hey, Daryl, it is, ladies and gentlemen, we have been preparing and getting geared up for the 10th anniversary of the untimely death of Michael Brown and the unrest in Ferguson that had an impact across the world. And as you know, last week, we kicked it off with the chief of police from Ferguson,
Chief Troy Doyle, and who was also on the scene 10 years ago, had a great perspective.
And today, we really going to do a deep dive into what has happened since then. But we're going to start off with we got an expert in the studio with us today.
We don't consider you an expert.
I'm not an expert.
You're not talking.
Okay, well, we got another expert in the room.
That's what we needed to know.
We got another expert in the room. But listen, we got Brother Carlton Mayers in the studio, and I'm going to let Carlton introduce himself and just give you some background. And Carlton, when you do that, make sure you talk about your roots as relates to Ferguson, and then we get into the discussion. How about that?
Okay, yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me here. Today. My name is Carlton T. Mayers II, Esquire. I'm a national public safety and policing reform expert. What I do is I'm also the CEO, founder, and owner of Mayers Strategic Solutions, LLC. What I do is I work with communities across the country. And when I say community, I mean community groups, law enforcement, private business, state and local government officials, local media, etc. I work with all the different stakeholders when it comes to public safety on breaking out of their silos to come together and solve public safety challenges like community violence, reckless driving, police accountability, etc. But doing it in a way where they're doing it with equity and inclusivity as one community, and they're doing it with more so proactive rather than reactive strategies. And the way that I've kind of come up with this approach of being able to help communities to do this is based on, like what you mentioned earlier, my background. So I've been doing this work for almost 20 years now. And some of that starts off with me working at NAACP National as the Criminal Justice Reform Director for the country. I was hired by Ben Jealous at the time when he was president, and I also worked under President Cornell William Brooks after him. While I was in that role, I had co-authored NAACP National's publication called the Born Suspect Report, Ending Racial Profiling Report. It was published in 2014, provides all kinds of information and context on how to end racial profiling by state and local police. And when that report was published in 2014, I actually had participated with President Pruitt on the Journey for Justice March that NAACP National held, which after Mike Brown's unjustified death. And it was a march from Ferguson, Missouri to Jefferson City, calling for justice for Mike Brown. And so during that march, I had presented to the marchers on the Born Suspect Report and how we could apply the information in it to finding solutions for that situation. Now, after that, I then transitioned over to NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund Incorporated, which is Thurgood Marshall's law firm. And I was the policy counsel for the Policing Reform Campaign, worked under Sherilyn Ifill's leadership for about almost 3 years. And this was out of Washington, D.C. While I was there, I worked on the Ferguson consent decree. And that was about close to 3 years. I was working on it from negotiation on up through implementation. And specifically what we did on behalf of LDF, my work there was working with the Special Litigation Department of the U.S. Department of Justice, working with the city of Ferguson, and also, most importantly, working with the community members from Ward 3 who their experiences, negative experiences with Ferguson Police Department were outlined and detailed in the DOJ's investigative report, pattern of practice investigative report. So what we were doing was working with them on two specific things. One is providing technical assistance to subject matter experts on national evidence-based best practices when it comes to policing reform. So making sure that that information was in the language of the consent decree. And if it's not in there, how do we make sure it still gets done through practice? So providing that. And then the other thing we did was making sure that The community members I talked about earlier, the ones that are detailed in the investigative report by the DOJ from Ward 3, that those specific community members have a voice in the consent decree process, because the way that consent decrees typically operate are that you only have the judge, the federal judge overseeing the case, the city, who's a party to the consent decree, and then the U.S. Department of Justice, who's the other party to the lawsuit settlement agreement or the consent decree. Those are the only parties who have any kind of say over if a consent decree is going to stay in place or be terminated, meaning that the police are good to go, they're in compliance, we don't need federal oversight anymore, okay? And so the people that are directly impacted, they don't have any voice in that. They don't have any say in if the consent decree should stay in place or be terminated. And that's a problem to me, because they're the ones being directly impacted by any reforms that are being put in place or lack thereof. So we need to make sure that they have a voice in the process, and we at LDF, we created that even though it was not required under the consent decree in Ferguson. So we worked with the court, the judge, with the city, the DOJ, to create mechanisms so that the community members, every other status conference hearing, when the judge and the court are meeting to have the parties talk about where's the consent decree at, they also provide for the community to have about 2 minutes per person for maybe a 30-minute segment where they just get to go on the microphone and give their perspective on what they think is going on with the consent decree. And that is on the record. It's not something that's just said and it just goes away into the ethers. No, it's on the record. You can go on the federal court, circuit court's website. You can look up all of those status conference hearings and hear the recording, read the minutes, and actually see the testimony of the directly impacted people.
It's obvious that you come highly qualified. And I mean, we've got a whole lot of questions, but for the essence of time, I'm not going to ask how you got selected. I understand, though, that you've been involved with mediating or crafting or participating in other consent decrees. When you look at others that you've been involved in, be it Milwaukee or Baltimore or Ferguson, how is Ferguson different than the others? Was Ferguson your first one, and how was Ferguson different from the others as far as how everything came about, the end result, your involvement in it?
Yeah, well, so I've also worked on the Baltimore consent decree, once again, from negotiation through implementation. I worked on the negotiation of the Chicago consent decree, and currently I live in Chicago, and I volunteer with the NAACP Chicago West Side Branch. I'm the criminal justice chair, and the NAACP Chicago West Side Branch is a party to the Chicago consent decree. So Chicago's consent decree is different than all other consent decrees in that it's the only one that from the very beginning has had the directly impacted people also be a party to it, in addition to the city and it used to be the U.S. Department of Justice, but after Trump got involved, they then took them out. So now it's the state attorney general that's doing it. But either way, they're the first one to actually include community members. Now, I can tell you how that evolved was that when we worked on Ferguson, the Baltimore consent decree was then being negotiated while the Ferguson consent decree was already starting to go up and was starting to move forward. So the DOJ from Baltimore was like, we really like what you guys did in Ferguson on having these mechanisms to allow the directly impacted people to have a voice during the status conference hearings. So what we would like to do is codify what you did and put it into the Baltimore consent decree. So now it's mandated that that's how we are going to communicate on this consent decree. So they then took it up a step and made it mandatory in their consent decree, while in Ferguson, it's a practice that we all agreed upon. And then in Chicago, they were like, listen, we want to do even better than that. We want to actually have the people as a party to the consent. So that's how that evolved.
Yeah, but so let's do this. Let's be clear. What is the Ferguson consent decree? What's in it?
Right.
And now, 10 years later, let's talk about what has been done with it. Let's just jump into it.
Yeah. So the Ferguson consent decree. So what a consent decree is, just in general, it's a court enforceable agreement that is essentially enforced in federal court. So when we say a court enforceable agreement, the best way to think about it is if you have a contract with like a plumber, right? You want them to come and do some work on your toilet. There's certain provisions in the contract that they have to do, certain things that you have to do. And once they do what they're supposed to do, they get paid, right? That's how it works. The way a consent decree works is that there's an agreement that law enforcement, and if there's other parties, like sometimes civilian oversight is a party as well, et cetera, they have to do certain things by a certain time period. If they don't do it, there's supposed to be consequences. The difference with the plumber's contract from a consent decree is that when the plumber doesn't do the job they're supposed to do, you don't pay them. And if they try to come at you, go to court, boom, the judge will suss it out. With the consent decree, when the city doesn't do what they're supposed to do, or the police department doesn't do what they're supposed to do, there usually aren't any penalties for that. There's just a conversation and understanding that going forward, they're going to do what they're supposed to do. And if they keep on not doing it, then the conversation just keeps on happening over and over with no enforcement, right? And so so when we talk about Ferguson, and you're like, where is it right now? Well, number one, the Ferguson consent decree, what it focused on were really two different pieces, right? One issue had to do with the courts, the municipal courts, and what was called a revenue generating system that should not have existed. It's unconstitutional, where they were essentially stopping people or ticketing them for minor offenses that had nothing to do with public safety. Okay, these are like quality of life offenses, just so low level. It's not even worth giving somebody a ticket, maybe a warning, maybe a conversation, walk away, right? However, Ferguson police were ticketing people, and when they were not showing up for their court dates or not paying the ticket, instead of putting them on an installment payment plan or some kind of community service, as an option, as an alternative, they would instead lock them up. And it's unconstitutional. It's actually Supreme Court law. You are not supposed to lock people up for being poor. And so that's what they were doing. They were locking them up, debtors' prisons, right? They were locking them up just because they owed a debt, not because they were a threat to public safety.
Hold that thought. We're going to do a quick commercial break. We'll be right back with more on Point Black. We're here with attorney Carlton Mayers, and we're talking about the Ferguson consent decree. And we're back. Ferguson, 10 years later, we got a conversation going. You were saying, Brother Myers?
Yeah, and so because what we had was this relationship, this toxic relationship between the municipal courts and the Ferguson Police Department, where the police were essentially giving out tickets and then arresting people for not being able to pay their ticket, and then the courts would assist in incarcerating them until the tickets were paid, and the courts would use that money to fund the courts. And so you had a system where the courts, the only way that they could thrive was based on these tickets. And so law enforcement were motivated to give out the tickets. Now, the issue, though, that really came up, and this is a fact, some of the data that came out of the U.S. Department of Justice's pattern of practice investigation. So when we're thinking about who was specifically adversely impacted by this practice of revenue generating system for the courts, well, African Americans were 68% less likely than others to have their cases dismissed by the court, and were more likely to have their cases last longer and result in more required court encounters. African Americans were also at least 50% more likely to have their cases lead to an arrest warrant, and of those actually arrested by the Ferguson Police Department, only because of an outstanding municipal warrant. That was 96% of those individuals were African American. So what we're talking about now is they're focusing on race, which we know is unconstitutional in regards to who they're targeting for this unconstitutional practice of debtors' prison. So we're talking about violations of the 14th Amendment, which has to do with opportunity to be heard, due process rights, under the legal system. You're not receiving that. So that was one thing that was focused under the consent decree, was we need to undo this toxic system of generating revenue from people that don't have money, right? That's the only reason, specifically poor black people. The other piece of it was focused on law enforcement and their activities with community members, once again, in particular black people, when it comes to violating their Fourth Amendment rights, like search and seizure. So when it comes to stopping people, are you actually stopping them based on reasonable suspicion? Or are you just doing it just because you're black and you're here? I'm gonna stop you, right? You're not allowed to do that. That's unconstitutional. Are you using force on people that's justified under the circumstances? Or are you using excessive force? What we saw in Ferguson is that there was, in the DOJ's pattern of practice report, one of the tools that law enforcement were using for force on African Americans specifically were canines. The majority of canine attacks or bites were African American citizens in Ferguson, not white citizens. Right. And so there was specific targeting for using specific types of force that were on specific populations, and that was found to be unconstitutional. Just to read you one factoid about that was that data collected by the Ferguson Police Department from 2012 to 2014 showed that African Americans accounted for 85% of vehicle stops, 90% of citations, 93% of arrests made by Ferguson Police Department officers, despite making up only 67% of Ferguson's general population. So you're already seeing there's a disparity there in the numbers, okay? And then also nearly 90% of documented force used by the Ferguson Police Department officers was used against African Americans. And in about every canine bite incident, the person bitten was African American.
Let me ask you, the biggest obstacle, because I mean, all of this, people fight back against change, and we're talking about social justice, we're talking about police. The obstacles that you faced as you went through this process to get to your finished product, what were some of the most glaring obstacles?
So I think the number one glaring obstacle, and we're going to talk about this a bit later because this ties into Ferguson and what's next for Ferguson. So when I first came to Ferguson, so this was back in 2014 when the mayor at the time, Knowles, I think was his name.
Yes.
Yeah, he was there, and I remember they were supposed to do a community meeting about the negotiation of the consent decree because initially when the lawsuit was filed by the DOJ after the pattern of practice report came out, the city was considering fighting it. They were not going to concede and have a lawsuit settlement agreement that would result in a consent decree. They were like, no, we don't agree with it, we're gonna fight it. And they deliberately prevented community members from being a part of those community meetings to talk about what are we gonna do about the consent decree. So that was my first experience with seeing the city deliberately be undemocratic, right?
Gotcha.
And then from there, I went to an event about a few months after that where people in the community were saying, we don't want a consent decree here. And they were talking about hiring an attorney who worked on another consent decree. I forgot which one it was, but there was another consent decree years prior where they did file a lawsuit against the DOJ, or they fought the DOJ's lawsuit, I should say it like that, to try to get them to do a consent decree. So they were like, we don't want to do a consent decree. We're going to fight your lawsuit. We don't agree with your pattern of practice report. He represented them, and he lost. And he was giving information to the city of Ferguson on, listen, if you're going to do this, this is how it's probably going to turn out. And you really need to understand it's going to be a steep hill to try to fight the DOJ on this because they already got the report. They got the evidence.
Right.
So they were considering it. They didn't win because the community from Ward 3 pushed back hard, and they had a lot of support from outside sources, the media, et cetera. What I'm worried about, it's been 10 years or going on 10 years, right? The media is not here anymore, okay? And what I'm hearing is that city council-wise, one of the big issues was we had a white mayor, we had white city council members, even though Ferguson was predominantly black. That was changed where now you have a black mayor and we had black city council members, majority. Now we still have a black mayor who's outgoing, but we have a city council that's now reverted back to majority white. So I'm worried that once federal oversight is done in Ferguson, we're going to see a regression, not only of police bad behavior, but just overall the power dynamic is going to change from what it was after Mike Brown to what it's going to be, which would be before Mike Brown. So it's something to think about. This is what they never wanted the consent decree. They were willing to fight on it, but they gave in. But now that they're about to or they're looking at wrapping it up at some point in the near future, what does that mean for Ferguson, seeing what's going on politically?
Does the status reports dictate when it's wrapped up and how is it wrapped up, or does it just simply have an expiration date?
So typically consent decrees are, and the way that they're drafted for Ferguson, initially they were talking about wrapping it up in 2 years from when the consent decree was initially enacted. That was what was being negotiated, but then they agreed to 5 years. And at the 5-year mark, then they would do an assessment to see where things are at. If they're not at a place where they're ready to start phasing them out, then we will extend it another 3 years, et cetera. So I think Ferguson has been like 10 years now.
Yeah, right.
So they've already hit their 5-year mark. So they've already extended the deadline of the consent decree beyond that mark, probably at least twice at this point. So you're already on your way to ending up like Oakland, California, who's been under consent decree for over 20 years. I think it's 21, 22 years as of this year. And so it's like there's no end in sight. There's no light at the end of the tunnel.
Is that because as part of the consent decree, there are goals and objectives? There's some measuring of success. And so if you don't see that measure of success, then you have to move forward. And based upon your comment black mayor, black police chief, even if it resorts back of Ferguson or wherever, any municipality, if it resorts back to white majority rule, wouldn't the consent decree had at least put in place some policy or procedure that had to be followed?
So, and going back to what you said about the measurements, which is a very important point, and this is going to also answer your question. So the way that consent decrees operate is that the first stage is to create the policy. Because everything that law enforcement does is based on policy.
Right.
Once you have, and the policy is supposed to be created in collaboration with the community. So that way you're getting those voices to also be a part of developing the policy. Once the policy is developed, the next thing is the training. Because any trainings that police do are based on a policy.
Right.
And so it all has to feed into each other, right? Once the training is done, now we have to start getting people to do the training, right? The police officers, new recruits, in-service officers. Once they do the training, now the monitor can look at the numbers. Okay, it's been 1 year from when you were trained. What are we seeing in practice? Are we seeing less use of force? Are we seeing less, arbitrary, traffic stops that are like pretextual stops, et cetera? If we're seeing the data on that over a period of time that's like 5 years and it's trending, it's showing, okay, the numbers are changing, it's consistent, then the next phase they'll go into is what they call the self-monitoring phase. And that's when they're starting to wrap up and phase out the consent decree. So that's when the city...
Explain self-monitoring, because right now they're monitored by the courts. And explain the monitoring, how it's monitored now and what self-monitoring is so the public understands what's about to happen. So the monitoring that's occurring right now, you have a monitor who has been selected by the parties, being the Department of Justice and the city of Ferguson, right? And the monitor is a series, subject matter experts, individuals who are known to either be good at monitoring regulations and or good at policing reform, right? They usually form a law enforcement, et cetera. So the whole point of the monitor is essentially to be the arm of the judge. That is their role, and that's their only role. So what that means is that they are there on behalf of the judge to monitor, to watch, are you developing the policies according to the consent decree? Are you developing the trainings according to the policies within the consent decree? Are you making sure that your officers are getting trained? And then after they're getting trained, are they actually doing what the consent decree says that they're supposed to do? When they look at all that data and they get those numbers, they give that to the judge. The judge, and that's what the status conference hearings are about. That's when the judge looks at the data and they talk to the parties and figure out where we at with this. Once they see that over time they have been consistent in compliance, now we're going to phase out the monitor, who's the arm of the judge, monitoring them so closely and hands-on, and now allow the city to do what they should have been doing anyway, which is to monitor themselves and hold themselves accountable. Now that we have the policies in place, the training, and the practice. Self-monitoring, though, you're saying hold themselves, so when they monitor themselves, do they still report that outcome to the judge? Okay.
And so the self-monitoring period will usually last about 2 years. Okay. And during that 2-year period, it'll be more of a hands-off approach from the monitor, where they're just kind of like looking in, they're not as hands-on, and they're going to let the city do it, but then they're going to still have that status conference hearing to hear, okay, what's going on, where's the data at, give that to the judge, and then at that point, the DOJ and the parties will decide, are they good enough now to say that this portion of the consent decree is done, is terminated?
We're going to send Daryl out there to monitor.
Listen, I wouldn't have any problem with it because, I always have a problem with policing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking to Carlton T. Maris II, Esquire, owner, founder, head consultant. I understand he cleans up sometimes too. Mayor's Strategic Solutions, LLC, the person responsible for not only helping to craft the consent decree in Ferguson, but also in Chicago and in Baltimore. One of the questions to Mr. Mayers, Pruitt and I, because he says I'm a progressive. I say I'm an independent. But anyway,
I'm getting nausea. I'm getting nausea. He said progressive. That makes my stomach hurt.
Can you get a consent decree before an incident takes place? I mean, all of this, and I guess the simple answer is no. But I mean, it goes back to prevention. I mean, public safety. I think it's about prevention and accountability. Has this consent decree, or the ones Ferguson, Baltimore, Chicago, I understand, are they being used as a template for other municipalities, for other jurisdictions?
So the way that the DOJ tends to, at least the more recent DOJ, being like the one under Biden and Merrick Garland,
Right.
what they've done, which is different than the Obama administration DOJ. So the Obama administration DOJ, they put the pattern of practice investigations, consent decrees on steroids at the time. I think they had like 23 or 26 ongoing pattern of practice investigations and like 20 or so, something like that, consent decrees that were ongoing under President Obama. And so what they were focused on was each location had their own nuances that were specific. So like Ferguson, the revenue generating system was the most predominant issue that was unique. You're not going to find that in Chicago. You're not going to find that in Baltimore, even though you still find the excessive use of force, the racial profiling in Baltimore, Chicago, and in Ferguson. And like, for instance, most recently they just issued, they released a pattern of practice investigation in Phoenix, Arizona. And so they're right now looking at trying to negotiate a lawsuit settlement agreement with them. And for them, they're really focused on the way that homeless people are treated.
Exactly.
And also people with mental health illness. Same thing with Minneapolis. Their consent decree is focused on people who are in crisis. Why? George Floyd. That was an in-crisis situation, okay? He was in crisis due to mental health, due to substance abuse. That's what that situation was. And so that's the primary focus of that, one of the primary focuses of that consent decree. So every one of them, they have their, unique aspects, their themes that are usually based on whatever is the big issue. And if there's a high-profile incident like a George Floyd, right, like a Mike Brown, then they're really going to hone in on whatever the theme was for that particular incident. Because more than likely, it wasn't a standalone. More than likely, there's been other incidents, and that was just the one that broke the camel's back, the straw that broke the camel's back, right?
So we know we got forward through Ferguson, and I know you're familiar with that, and we got the consent decree. So can you reconcile the two? I mean, it'd be interesting to understand that.
And I think I think you just hit the nail on the head, because that's essentially what needs to happen. Okay, so when we think about President Obama and we think about policing reform and public safety, what did it look like in this country when he was president? It was the 21st century policing. Okay, that's what it was. When Trump became president, it became law and order policing, right? And now under Biden, before I even say that, then we had 2020.
Right.
And that was the BLM protest, the defund movement, right? So that changed everything, because now when people were thinking about 21st century policing, which is very police-centered, now they were thinking, well, no, public safety is bigger than police. Public safety is well-lit street lamps. Public safety is walkable sidewalks. Public safety is cleanliness, clean areas.
Quit sounding like a progressive, though. Keep going. Keep
But it's true.
Keep going.
This is the conversation.
Dr. Mears, you just do what you do.
This is the conversation, because now they're talking about mental health. They're talking about youth.
Exactly.
These
transforming
are
policing.
that it involves police, but it's not involving
Adolfus.
police the way that we think about police.
Sir,
right?
You just messed him up. You just messed him up.
Quit agreeing with Daryl Gray, sir.
You just messed him up.
It's not only me agreeing with you.
Thank you.
I know.
It's also
I got
the
you.
Biden administration,
Right.
like the Merrick Garland. So the thing about Merrick Garland's DOJ that's different than Eric Holder's DOJ and Loretta Lynch's DOJ, okay, is that Merrick Garland's DOJ, they are considering what came out of the 2020 protests. What were the calls to action? What were people demanding? Outside of defund, they were demanding, we want to see more investment into social services. We want to see law enforcement not be the points of contact for every little thing. And so what's been happening is like the Minneapolis consent decree, the Phoenix, Arizona consent decree, the mechanisms that the DOJ have put in there, these are now new national evidence-based best practices that are now looking more like what the demands and calls to action were out of the Black Lives Matter, movement, rather than what 21st century policing was calling for. So you'll see them having mechanisms where, okay, let's have a mobile crisis unit that's only mental health professionals responding to somebody who's in crisis, rather than police who's armed responding to somebody in crisis.
But how does that differ with forward through Ferguson and the consent? I'm trying to figure out. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. Do they mesh together, or are they really two different dynamics?
So at the end of the day, they all mesh together, because anything that relates to public safety in any community is always going to feed into it. It's always going to connect to it. The problem is this: if the people in the community, including law enforcement and government officials, if they're not seeing where the dots connect, and they're not able to start being creative with coordinating and connecting those dots, that's when you start to see people fall at the wayside, right? We talk about, restorative justice, we talk about diversion,
Right.
and you're like, well, people are not getting connected to the community-based resources, and what happens? They end up getting locked up, they end up coming out, and they end up recidivating, right? They reoffend and get reincarcerated. Public safety goes down, crime goes up. So when we're not connecting the dots on resources in the community, people get left at the wayside, and then that's when we get that situation. So to me, when we talk about Ferguson Forward, we talk about the consent decree. My thing is this: what conversations are happening and are going to continue to happen on how the people of Ferguson think
Right.
that we can connect the dots on this? Not the big head government officials only, not the police only, right? Not only private business either, because
Or
they
not,
got the money.
or not organizers only either.
And not only organizers,
Right.
but everybody.
Right.
And most importantly, and this is where the community empowerment centered approach and the CAP method, I know I didn't go into detail on that, but that's what I've developed based on my experience doing this work for almost 20 years. And that's why that's important, because what it's based on is making sure that the people most directly impacted by both crime and by negative police interactions like racial profiling, excessive use of force, etc. Those are the people that need to be involved in, need to have knowledge of, and most importantly, need to have meaningful decision-making authority over all direct police-civilian interactions.
So in my head, I hear the people that's listening saying, okay, let's help me out. Make it simple. Make it easy for me. You got this Ferguson consent decree, and you got the forward through Ferguson. And all of these things are 10 years old. Is anything in any of them working in your estimation based on what you know now 10 years later? And if they are, what is working and what is not?
So if you're asking me what I think
Just
is
your opinion, your professional opinion.
So, and I can't say for the Ferguson Forward. What I can say for the consent decree, when we talked about the municipal court issues related to the revenue generating system,
we know that's gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's gone. All right.
Gone.
And I think it's gone because the Obama administration made such a big deal out of it. They made sure to work with the media on it and with other organizations outside of Missouri and in Missouri to turn that whole thing around.
And ladies and gentlemen, just as a quick note, and we're going to have Blake Stroh on one of the shows with
Arch City Defenders.
Who actually sued
They did
Ferguson
sue. Yes, they did.
on that issue and won a big settlement. So we know it's gone.
That's gone. That's gone. And the good thing about it is that what LDF and the Obama administration wanted, which was that whatever happened in Ferguson to have like a domino effect and spread out to all of St. Louis County, because we knew that Ferguson's numbers were nowhere near as bad as the other adjacent municipalities. When
Preach, brother, preach.
And it was actually
Missouri in general.
It was actually the Arch City Defenders that we were working with on that, because they were filing lawsuits against all those other municipalities for the same thing. So, we did actually get that done, because I've heard that even in those other adjacent municipalities, that revenue generating system is gone.
Plus, there was legislation out the Senate.
Right, there
Senate
was.
Bill 43, I think it was. I can't remember. But there was legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take one more break. We'll be right back with more Ferguson 10 years later, consent decree, policing, Reverend Daryl Gray, protester. We got it going on up in here. And we are back. Daryl,
Great conversation. Man,
I
listen,
got to
great
ask you.
conversation.
I got to ask you.
Go ahead, ask me.
Before we get back to Carlton.
I did.
We both were out there dealing with Ferguson 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And on the front lines and behind the scenes and everything else. 10 years later, we've heard from Carlton, but 10 years later, what you think?
You know what? I follow a quote that the late Reverend Dr. Joseph Lowry used to use, president of SCLC. Everything has changed, but nothing has changed. I think the reality is that I think it's great that there's a black mayor. I think that it's great that we have a black police chief. I think that it's good that a lot of the actors that were on the ground, organizers, activists, protesters, some of them went on to become national figures. But I still think that because the same issues that existed that caused Ferguson, I think those issues have not dissipated. I think that's the reality. I think that, yes, we have process, we have procedure, we have training. We may have those things within the system, But I think that when we go out there on the ground and look around in Ferguson, I think that the storm that created the tsunami, I think that still exists.
You know, Doc, you heard what Reverend Gray said, and so my question to you is, if let's say he's 1,000% right, I'm not saying he's not. I'm just saying let's just say he is.
Because I'm usually not. So
Yeah, well, no, let's just say he is. My question to you, as the expert in this area, what should the citizens of Ferguson be doing right now to ensure that, one, if the consent decree go away or whatever happens,
Right.
that they can ensure that what happened 10 years ago does not repeat itself going forward? What should they be doing?
Great question, Adolfus. You could be a progressive.
Insurance salesman.
That's a great question.
So to answer that question, there's actually already examples looking at other municipalities that have been under consent decree and have been able to show progress in the long term since then that we could look to for some insights on what could be done, right? Because there is no one size fits all answer to this, right? Every community is different. They got their own demographics, their own history, their own culture. All of that stuff has to align with any kind of solutions if you want them to be long-term solutions rather than short-term solutions. So when we look at, for instance, well, first I want to tell you just two examples real quick of cities where we've seen where they've had a termination of their consent decree, and then we've seen a regression of bad behavior in 3 years. For example, when Obama was president, Detroit, Michigan came under consent decree, right? Their consent decree was terminated in 2015. So they really were under consent decree for maybe 5 years. 3 years. It wasn't that long. Let's just say it just wasn't a long time. Now, when we look 5 years after that, 2020, right? The big protest, the biggest we ever had in U.S. history, okay? When we look at the way that the protests were handled by the Detroit Police Department, they were just as bad as most other police departments around the country, which to me doesn't make sense if you were under consent decree, not even that long ago. And in order for you to get off consent decree, you had to be in compliance with those kinds of practices. So why didn't that translate 5 years later when you're having these protests? Now, I did notice in Ferguson, when they had the protests there, from what I heard, it was handled fairly well by the police, which makes sense to me considering you're under consent decree. That's a part of the consent decree was also, I should have mentioned this, I almost forgot to mention, was the way that the First Amendment demonstrations were handled by police or mishandled. People being able to exercise free speech and that they were violating those rights, the way that they use force on them, the lack of dispersal orders in a timely fashion, all that good stuff. So when we look at, Ferguson in 2020, did they actually adhere to the consent decree when it came to engaging with protesters? From what I saw and heard, yes. We look at Detroit. It was only 5 years ago that their consent decree was terminated. Did they do that? No. They were just as bad as NYPD. So, it just goes to show how effective are consent decrees when only 5 years after it's been terminated, the police department's already gone back to bad behavior.
But the community, what I'm saying is, the community is saying, let's just say the community in Ferguson is saying, no more. We're not going to have a repeat of what happened. I'm just trying to figure out what is it that they can really do to prevent that. Not that you haven't addressed it, but I really would love to hear.
Yeah. So getting right on that. So the reason I brought up Detroit was just to give you an example of a city that's been under consent decree recently, was terminated in less than 10 years, and already we've seen in less than 5 years, because really it's 3 to 5 years we'll start seeing regression is what studies have shown. And now I've heard from people in the DOJ, in Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico, they're in the process of terminating their consent decree. They've been having their status conference hearings on it, and the DOJ saying they're seeing 2 years as being the amount of time that police departments start to regress, right? And they're looking at Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, where they're at that phase of the self-monitoring, and then they've already started backsliding, and so now they're once again completely under consent decree. So when we look at the facts, these are the facts, this is what will happen. How can we prevent that? So there's one example of a city that's been under consent decree that since the consent decree has been terminated, they have not backslidden. They did not backslide. And that is Cincinnati, Ohio. Okay? So
did they fire all the police and start over?
They didn't do that.
Oh.
They did, but they did fire police. They did have a start over, but it wasn't that extreme.
Right.
They did it in, I'd say, a more incremental way that seemed to make more sense. And so what they did is, Obama spoke into this when he was president, where he actually said during his speeches, I think in 2015, that Cincinnati, Ohio is an excellent example of community policing, okay? And so the reason why he said that is because Cincinnati, Ohio came under consent decree, I believe it was 2004. They had a high-profile incident of a black man that was killed by police. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. There have been a lot of these incidents happening prior. And so what they did is they filed a lawsuit. The DOJ came in, they filed their lawsuit, and then they consolidated both lawsuits into the consent decree, the lawsuit settlement agreement for Cincinnati, Ohio. They were under consent decree for 10 years, and then they were terminated. Now, while they were under consent decree, the community members in Cincinnati, law enforcement, police unions, government officials, et cetera, they were like, we got to make sure that what we're doing with this stays in place after the consent decree is terminated. Right. So we're going to create our own document, our own actionable, workable, tangible document that we can hold each other to account to that will mirror the same provisions in the consent decree, but it's going to be locally driven, locally based, and that's what we're going to have. And so guess what? They call it the CA, the Collaborative Agreement, the Cincinnati Collaborative Agreement. And that collaborative, so the consent decree was in place for 10 years in Cincinnati. The Cincinnati Collaborative Agreement has been in place now for over 20 years. Okay, it's been over 20 years that it's been in place. I'm actually in touch with the community leader who's led that effort. Her name is Iris Rowley. She's a big name celebrity. She's doing great work, and she works with the police and the city government and the police union on making sure to keep that agreement in place and making sure that's being implemented. Even though they've had new mayors, new city managers, new police chiefs, they've still been able to preserve that agreement and implementation of it.
But you have the document, but you're right. You've got, and that's, I think we talked about that early on in the show. That's the end result. You have that document. It's a document of policy. It's a document of procedure. It's got public buy-in, community buy-in. It's got political will. The culture's changed. I mean, Chief Troy Doyle talked about, when you asked him, Pruitt, about the makeup of the police department, he said, well, really, we only probably have about 4 people left from 10 years ago. So it's a brand new department, brand new chief who happens to be black. You've got the example of the consent decree and that. And so I guess that does go back, Adolfus, to then what needs to happen. As you said, all of these things need to happen. And that's why I was joking when I said the complete turnaround of the police and changing everybody, because there's got to be a culture shift.
Right.
So would the recommendation be that the group that came together that did Ferguson Forward or Forward Through Ferguson, would they be the ones to get with the community and try to put together this collaborative agreement to come in place post-consent decree, or does it have to be driven solely by the members and the citizens of the city of Ferguson?
I think it needs to be a collaborative effort that would involve the city, the citizens, the police department, the police union, and really try to see if there's a way to make it work. Now, you may not be able to do it the way Cincinnati did it, right? Because like you said earlier, every city, every municipality, every locality has their own nuances, history, demographics, culture. It's going to differ, which means the solutions are going to differ, right? It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. So looking to Cincinnati as guidance, I think, would be helpful, but not trying to do what they did exactly, right?
Sure.
Because you got to do your own authentic process. And figuring that out, I think, is going to be the key. Maybe Ferguson Forward is the best place to start with it. Maybe it's not. You might hear from other people, well, Ferguson Forward got a lot of stuff in it that, may not apply the way it used to. Maybe we need to update it first, right? We're now using artificial intelligence and facial recognition and all these technologies that were not being used 10 years ago in the same way. So we need to update the document and make sure that that is included in whatever we do going forward.
We want to make sure that everybody understands we know it's Forward Through Ferguson. So I know you've got some people out there going to be a little bit sensitive if we keep calling it Ferguson Forward. It is Forward Through Ferguson. So we want to make sure people understand that we do know who we're talking about.
And we are out of time, ladies and gentlemen. It's a conversation that we have to bring to an end. We were talking about Ferguson, 10 years after the fact. And we appreciate Carlton. We do appreciate you coming here, joining us, bringing us up to speed on the show. And I think we are out of here, Dr. BJ.
Take us home, BJ.